The Reign of Terror had traumatized French society, leaving a death toll and legacy of political violence, which seemed unprecedented in modern memory for most Europeans. The coup launched against Robespierre and Thermidor had sought to end the Jacobin dictatorship. The so-called Thermidorians, who now assume power, faced a series of daunting tasks as they set to work. In the wake of the terror, there was a need for a period of stability and reconciliation. France needed to be rehabilitated, a stable government had to be set up, and radical republicanism had to be curbed. In spite of the excesses of Robespierre and the Jacobins, the Thermidorians were republicans. Their views were moderate in comparison to the Jacobins, but they nonetheless had ambitions of re-establishing a functioning republic. Above all, they sought to place French government on a solid constitutional foundation and re-establish the rule of law in the country. In essence, Thermidorians were faced with the task of providing an alternative to the radical and revolutionary government of the Jacobins. They intended to lay the foundation for a post-terror republic that would uphold the ideals of 1789 while avoiding the radicalism and excesses of the 1790s. Justice is the order of the day, as the new government proclaimed. Yet what did justice imply? Immediately following the coup against the Robespierrists, the government took aim at the radicals. Former political enemies, like the Girondins, were permitted to hunt down former Jacobin officials and sans-culotte leaders, carrying out revenge killings. Jacobin clubs were purged, and members hauled before tribunals to answer for their crimes. The Jacobin terror apparatus was dismantled and replaced with a new security state that would impose and enforce justice against all those who threatened the stability of the Republic. Following this political purge, a new constitution was proclaimed in 1795, year 3 according to the revolutionary calendar. This intended to anchor the Republic in a new legal regime, which would place the state on a stable footing. The so-called Directory government established by the Thermidorians was based on moderate principles. The Constitution provided for a balance of power between the branches of government. This careful system of checks and balances was to ensure that no single person or faction could take control of the government, as the Jacobins had done. The Thermidorians were also conscious of how the Jacobins had used universal suffrage to support the drift toward dictatorship. They had rallied people with fiery speeches and nationalist appeals to gain broad support for their illiberal policies. Taking this experience to heart, moderates maintained a patent distrust of popular democracy. The masses could be easily swayed and manipulated, it was argued, and this led ultimately to tyranny. Under the new constitution, voting rights were scaled back to prevent against the demagoguery that had encouraged Robespierre's rise to power. The old idea of active citizenship was reinstated. Material and moral requirements were once again required to hold voting rights. Those with property and those who were educated were fit to lead society, moderates insisted. Although it was clearly a reaction to the radical democratic movements of the 1790s, this idea was not necessarily distinct from the logic of the Jacobins. While Enlightenment thinkers had stressed man's natural rights, Robespierre had emphasized the need for virtue in the true republican citizen. But virtue was a quality, not a condition. While all may possess natural rights, not everyone possessed virtue. And this idea of the virtuous citizen could easily be used to defend a system of restricted voting. one that favored property holders and educated elites to the exclusion of the general populace. These ideas broadly came to define the post-terror republic in France, a regime that was constitutional but hardly disposed toward mass democracy. And while this arrangement saw through the regime change desired by moderates, it did not mean that the Directory was popular with the general public. The Republic faced a dire economic crisis as the new government took charge. On top of this, France was still at war with the European powers. The wealth that the war brought in from conquered territories was needed by the government, and this entailed continuing the war efforts started by the radicals. The war cause appealed to the people's sense of patriotism, and the Directory hoped it could use this to bolster support for its shaky regime. To this end, the new government retained the territories occupied by the French army in Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. These areas were transformed into sister republics, territories liberated by the French from absolutist rule. These so-called sister republics were organized around the principle of national self-determination. Government, Republicans argued, should reflect the collective will of the people. This meant that territories occupied by French forces would be given their own national governments and serve as allies to the French Republic in its struggle against absolutist monarchy. Over the next 5 years, this last objective was the only one that met with any real success. Unable to remedy the country's economic problems and unpopular with the general public, the Directory found itself in a constantly precarious situation as unemployment, scarcity, and growing inequalities in wealth persisted. It was in this atmosphere that the political organizer Gracchus Babeuf began making a name for himself. Jailed on various occasions in the past for his radical views, Babeuf presented himself as a champion of the oppressed and suffering working classes. He set up a secret society in which all members called themselves simply the Equals. He ran a newspaper entitled Tribune of the People. With mounting economic pressure on the French working classes, Babeuf drafted a new manifesto in 1795, entitling it The Conspiracy of the Equals. In this document, Babeuf called for the equal distribution of wealth and the abolition of private property. He denounced the new Directory in power, arguing that a constitutional regime did not guarantee true equality. True equality, in his view, meant social equality, and this meant empowering the workers and redistributing the wealth of the country. Songs carrying Babeuf's message were sung in the cafes where workers socialized, with lyrics like Mourant de faim, mourant de froid, dying of hunger, dying of cold. These became rallying cries for a new opposition of the lower classes. Only a year after Robespierre had been deposed, the specter of sans-culotte radicalism was already pestering the regime. This time, the government had no intention of letting the radicals get the upper hand. The Directory summarily rounded up Babeuf and his associates. They were tried for conspiracy against the government and executed, putting an end to the threat of another revolutionary reign of terror. Although suppressed, the resurgence of Jacobin-style radicalism was indicative of a larger problem. The French Revolution had given rise to various aspirations and expectations. It had animated society and created a restless energy that needed to be pacified. The question was, Could this revolutionary fervor exist within the confines of a stable society? This was by no means certain as the 1790s progressed, and faith in the Directory diminished. For some, these circumstances appeared ominous. Yet others were capable of seeing new possibilities in these worrying times. This was particularly true of a young and ambitious military commander quickly coming to the forefront of French political life. Capitalizing on the growing sense of discontent and disillusionment that was setting in, Napoleon Bonaparte intended to turn crisis into opportunity. The star of the Directory may have been waning, but Napoleon's was only just beginning to rise. I owe everything to the people and the army, Napoleon once claimed, and in this there could be little doubt. A Corsican from a minor noble family, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army to acquire a reputation as an effective and competent commander. He had fought in Italy, claiming it for France and setting up a series of new republican governments that would fundamentally transform the Italian peninsula. Napoleon professed a deep commitment to the ideas of the Enlightenment and republicanism, claiming that, in his military exploits, he sought nothing but the defense of France and the spread of its noble revolution across Europe. And as his military prestige grew, so too did his popularity and association with the revolution. He was hailed as a man who had risen to greatness through his own merit and achievements, attaining glory for the revolution and republic on the battlefield. For many citizens, Napoleon was the embodiment of what the revolution symbolized, an accomplished individual who had not come from a privileged background, a true child of the revolution, as the general liked to think of himself. Napoleon was aware of the unpopularity of the Directory. He was also aware of the desire for stability following the Terror, and recognized that the shaky Directory was incapable of fulfilling this need. However, he was also aware of what the revolution meant to the country. It had become a source of pride for the nation. It had brought France glory and made it the focus of the world. Politicians and political thinkers continued to support its values of liberty and equality, even if they condemned the Jacobins. In essence, Napoleon understood that the revolution could not be suppressed or stamped out. Its appeal, and its mythology even, were too powerful. He himself had fought in the Revolutionary Army and made his name by it. Nonetheless, the revolution had to be tamed. In contrast to the Republican government, Napoleon presented himself as a man of order, a strong individual who could restore confidence in government and rein in unruly forces. As he would remark, "The revolution ends with me." But he also added, "The revolution ends with me because I am the revolution." Conscious of the Bonapartist movement that was growing up in the country by the late 1790s, certain Republican officials began conspiring with the general, believing that this child of the revolution could provide an alternative to the weak Directory. His popularity with the people was unmatched, and the need for a stronger government to tackle the problems faced by the country was clearly evident. Therefore, in 1799, Napoleon and his followers orchestrated a coup against the Republic, overthrowing the regime and installing himself as the head of state. To deal with the problems besetting French society, Napoleon first created a large and extensive bureaucracy that any absolutist monarch would have been envious of. State-appointed prefects were selected to govern each department of the country. These officials, responsible to the Ministry of the Interior in Paris, were charged with collecting taxes, enforcing the law, devising new economic policies, and carrying out all government policies flowing directly from the capital. These reforms drew support from Jacobins as well as absolutists, who believed that a strong state was preferable to the faltering Republic of the Directory. Under the Napoleonic regime, tax collection became more efficient and public revenues rose. The economic downturn that had accompanied the revolution began to be reversed as the mechanisms of state administration were vastly improved and perfected. Officials were ordered to make extensive reports of each region of the country regarding resources, land use, and the population. From this information, detailed annual budgets were produced, adding a regularity to state finances that had been severely lacking since the outbreak of the revolution. Under Napoleon, the state became a rational and well-organized machine that was capable of penetrating down to the most basic levels of society. In showing his dedication to the revolutionary ideal of equality, Napoleon enforced a rigid legal equality, insisting that social status and privilege meant nothing before the law. Equality before the law became the guiding maxim for the new Code Napoleon, issued in 1804. Formal legal procedures and the rights of every citizen were clearly spelled out under this new law code, dictating that the state would abide by certain rules that could not be violated. In this way, Napoleon sought to appease liberal constitutionalists, who believed that the powers of government had to be outlined and guaranteed by a contract. If Napoleon supported the revolution, he equally supported order and stability, and these two goals, fulfilling the aspirations of the revolution on one hand, yet resisting the anarchy of Jacobin-style republicanism on the other, became the guiding principles of a Napoleonic government dedicated to implementing an orderly revolution, one that was neither reactionary nor radical. And yet, if Napoleon's policies revealed his dedication to the ideas of the Enlightenment and the values of the revolution, in 1804, Napoleon did something that seemed at odds with his revolutionary character. That year, he declared himself head of a new French empire, officially marking an end to the Republic and, as he claimed, the revolution itself. The Napoleonic Empire was presented as a compromise between order and revolution, between security and the radicalism that the revolution had unleashed. If the empire upheld the ideals of 1789, it resisted the excesses of Republican radicalism. While many Republican critics saw the empire as a contradiction, or worse still, a betrayal to the liberal values of the revolution, there was one thing that made this imperial government sustainable: the strong man at the center, Napoleon himself. Even if the revolution had ended in France, as Napoleon claimed, the new emperor was able to keep its spirit and purpose alive. And he did this by channeling the fervor and idealism of the revolution outward. Continuing the wars in Europe, Napoleon committed his empire to spreading the values of the revolution across the continent. Between 1799 and 1812, French armies would march into Italy, across Germany, and into Poland. Everywhere the French went, new nations and kingdoms would be created. In each of these new states, absolutist monarchs were deposed and feudal institutions abolished. New constitutions were granted, recognizing these states as sovereign entities. Legal systems modeled on the Napoleonic Code were put into place, guaranteeing legal equality. People were encouraged to think of themselves as citizens and, in some cases, national brothers, not subjects of an absolutist monarch. The flip side of this was that Napoleon empowered princes and rulers faithful to him. These new constitutional nations and kingdoms were intended to be satellite states beholden to the French Empire, guaranteeing French influence across continental Europe. However, Napoleon depicted his armies as liberators, not imperialists. French forces were helping oppressed national groups fight for their independence against absolutist monarchies. They were assisting in the creation of new nations and kingdoms based upon the will of the people, or at least so they claimed. Frenchmen committed to the revolutionary program could now seek to fulfill it abroad in Europe. In quieting the revolutionary furies at home, Napoleon had redirected them outward. Generals and military officials could express their patriotism by fighting in Germany or Italy. They could engage in revolutions in Poland or the Balkans, playing out the struggles for freedom and national independence on the European periphery rather than inside France. In harnessing the emotional and ideological power of the French Revolution, Napoleon created a revolutionary empire that intended to transform Europe, recasting the continent through the values and ideals first announced in 1789. Napoleon's commitment to order at home became a special point of contention when it came to the Atlantic colonies. One major point of concern was that events in Santo had never fully settled down. Slaves had responded to the Jacobin call to liberation, taking up arms and fighting for the Republic. By the late 1790s, the slave armies had managed to take control of the island, and this was due in large part to the military commander Toussaint Louverture. An effective general, he had been instrumental in rallying slaves to the Republican cause. By the end of the decade, Louverture had managed to secure his power throughout the island. In fact, by 1801, he had become so powerful that he drafted a constitution for the island, confirming the abolition of slavery and naming himself governor of Santo Domingo for life. He had not bothered to consult France on this matter. He had even begun launching military expeditions into neighboring Santo Domingo with the intention of liberating slaves under Spanish rule. In these unilateral and increasingly radical policies, Paris was now inclined to see the threat of Black Jacobinism. In reality, Napoleon had already been planning to clamp down on the Atlantic colonies. In need of cash to fund his wars, the once profitable sugar industries of the Caribbean needed to be revived, and this would mean reinstalling slavery. Obviously, Louverture's bold gestures indicated military force would be required in this endeavor. His constitution already hinted that Louverture might be trying to set up an autonomous government, and this appeared too ambitious for the tastes of Paris. Louverture needed to be removed, and French control reimposed over the island. In 1802, troops were dispatched across the Atlantic to deal with the recalcitrant Louverture. The general Charles-Emmanuel Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, was selected to head the military expedition. Arriving on Saint-Domingue, he sought out Louverture and had him and his entire family arrested. On the orders of Leclerc, Louverture was deported to France and imprisoned. While on the ship headed to France, Louverture used the moment to issue a firm warning to his captors, remarking that although they might have captured him, they could not suppress the desires for freedom that the former slaves of the colony were fighting for. In overthrowing me, you have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty in Saint-Domingue. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are many and they are deep. Louverture was found guilty of treason and imprisoned, eventually dying of pneumonia in jail a year later due to the mistreatment suffered at the hands of his captors. Yet despite his death, his words proved to be prophetic. When Leclerc attempted to disarm the thousands of former slaves that had served under Louverture, they fiercely resisted. French military force inspired another revolt, as the former slaves formed guerrilla bands in the mountains and carried on the war against the French. In their effort to defeat the rebels, French forces used increasingly brutal tactics, provoking a violent conflict in which former slaves trained under Louverture carried on the resistance movement, leading to the complete disintegration of French rule in the colony. By late 1803, the French cause was completely lost. On the 1st of January 1804, one of Louverture's top generals who had carried on the resistance, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, announced the island's independence from France, declaring Saint-Domingue was now the independent and sovereign nation of Haiti. According to Dessalines, the new nation would serve as a bastion of unity against European racism and imperialism, offering refuge to any enslaved people throughout the world who made it to its shores. The same did not, however, apply to remaining white French colonists on the island. As the French military pulled out, Dessalines and his men went from city to city, massacring any white that attempted to stay. Just as it had begun, the Haitian Revolution ended in a wave of racial violence and brutality. Haiti was the third nation to be born from the revolutionary struggles that had been coursing through the transatlantic world since the 1770s. Yet its birth marked a radical turn in the events of these revolutionary movements. Here was a nation of former slaves who had fought for their liberty and overturned an oppressive colonial regime. Ideally, this should have been celebrated as a victory for the revolutionary cause throughout the world, demonstrating the struggles of an oppressed and disenfranchised people against an imperial power. However, the world is not ideal. Shortly after declaring independence, a Haitian delegation requested a meeting with the President of the United States to seek international recognition for the new country. Certainly, the American Republic, having been a former colony itself and having declared independence from a tyrannical imperialism, would sympathize with the Haitian cause for liberty. The president at this time was Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson, a Southern slave owner himself, flatly refused the request. A nation of free slaves did not bode well for a country that tolerated the institutions of slavery. Indeed, many American planters disapproved of the Haitian Revolution from the start, fearing it might inspire slaves in the southern states to revolt against their own masters. In general, the radicalization of the French Revolution had alarmed many American politicians. It was feared, and not without reason, that the extreme equality preached by French Republicans could inspire a second revolutionary movement in the United States, undoing all that had been achieved during the war against the British. Various American political spokesmen had adopted a conservative stance by the mid-1790s, criticizing the violence and anarchy of the French Revolution and silencing public displays of support for the Jacobin cause at home. However, the problem was not just dangerous French ideas. From the start, the new republic had been quite unstable. Upon assuming the presidency, Washington had recognized that factionalism was threatening to tear the country apart. Political infighting had only risen since the end of the American War. There was little agreement on how the government should run or what direction the new country should take. On top of this, the violence in the West was far from over. On the contrary, tensions between settlers and Native Americans remained persistent as bloodshed and violent reprisals between whites and native tribes continued unabated. In 1786, a newspaper favorable to settler opinion, the Pittsburgh Gazette, gave an ominous warning. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. This next act was to be a Western Revolution, a revolution carried out for the frontiersmen demanding the protection of their property and interests. To make matters worse, Western settlers were highly suspicious of the new government. It was feared, and rightfully so, that the state would favor land speculators and financial companies who had purchased land out west under questionable means. George Washington himself was one of these speculators, having been a chief stockholder in the Virginia Land Company that had sold plots of land in Ohio. For many settlers, this was unacceptable. The land was theirs. They had gone out and claimed it, fighting against natives and protecting their families in the process. A conflict between speculators and squatters, not to mention between whites and native tribes, was in the making. And at the heart of these tensions lay the question of whether settlers would recognize the authority of the US government and allow it to formulate a policy, or would they take measures into their own hands? And this question was soon to be answered. In 1791, the federal government imposed an excise tax on whiskey to raise money. This immediately set off a wave of protests in western Pennsylvania. Many farmers there customarily distilled their own grain liquor. In fact, it was even used as a medium of exchange in some communities. Westerners felt the government was doing nothing to protect them against natives. They claimed it was acting more in the interests of rich speculators rather than the common people. And now, they were being asked to pay. On top of this, war veterans who had settled in the region did not look favorably upon the new tax. They had fought a war against taxation, and they were willing to continue fighting this war if necessary. In essence, they would continue the American Revolution against the American government. As these tensions escalated, radicals threatened to break with the government and form an independent Western nation. The so-called Whiskey Rebellion presaged a virtual civil war as Westerners brandished revolutionary symbols and gave voice to radical views. They even formed committees of correspondence to establish ties with people in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. In essence, Pennsylvanians were using the rhetoric of the revolution to craft their own revolutionary ideology of independence and equality. Given the circumstances, the government had to come to a decision on the Western question, and quickly. To deal with the settlers, Washington assembled an army and sent it into Pennsylvania. The rebels were suppressed, the whiskey tax enforced, and order restored. The point was clear. The government, not the people, had the authority to make laws and dictate order, and it was willing to use force to do so if necessary. In this way, one of the big questions of the American Revolution was finally answered. To deal with the native tribes, Washington carried out a full-fledged military campaign against any tribe that refused to negotiate or lay down arms. Once the Confederation of Tribes was subdued, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Under the treaty, the tribes were classified as conquered nations. The Ohio region would be a place for white settlers to live, and the government would take a leading role in regulating settlement. The tribes were pushed further west, establishing a trend that would see American settlers increasingly move westward as they expanded across the expanse of the North American continent, with little regard for the native communities living there. Much as with Napoleonic Europe, American westward expansion would seek to channel the aspirations and spirit of the Revolution into a new imperial project. The need for security at home encouraged the displacement and exportation of revolutionary energies elsewhere. In this process, liberated nations like France and the United States became revolutionary empires driven by new emancipatory ideologies. Naturally, these were not the empires of old. These new revolutionary empires were intended to be empires of liberty, inspired by desires of spreading their revolutionary programs, and, as one commentator claimed, shining the light of the age across all corners of the globe.